Hi there, welcome to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name is Joshua Bissell, and I'm the editor of this weekly podcast where we tackle topics of abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. During the month of March, we're going to be starting a new series. We'll be taking a good look at why the places in our society that should be the safest are often the most vulnerable to abuse and to false allegations of abuse. This week, we're going to start off by taking a look at faith organizations and why they seem to be such big targets for those who want to take advantage of the vulnerable. I hope that this episode is informative and that you enjoy your time with us. Thank you for joining us at Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet.
You've heard me say on more than one occasion that no segment of our society is immune to abuse. During the month of March, I'd like to talk about why different sectors within our society are not immune to abuse. Those reasons are different. So we are going to look at different segments during the month of March. Today, I'm going to speak about the faith community, why the faith community finds themselves very susceptible and vulnerable to issues of abuse. I want to start off by telling you a quick case study of an older man that was working within a church that had been attending the church most of his life, was an active leader within the church, was involved both at a deacon level and also working with the midweek children's program. He had a huge heart and he had been faithful for many years serving. He would offer to drive kids from the neighboring community into the midweek service every week. Two of the boys that he picked up were foster children, and he would pick them up from their home and he would bring them in every week for the midweek program. Sometimes these boys would cause some problems and challenges, but people cared deeply for these two boys. The two boys disclosed to their foster parent that this volunteer had sexually abused them on the ride into the midweek program. As you can imagine, this caused great difficulty and hardship and heartbreak for everyone that was involved. The volunteer denied doing anything inappropriate. The church was split. Part of the church said, yes, there was some questionable interaction, and yes, it could have easily happened. The other half of the church completely stood by the volunteer and said that these two boys were trouble from the beginning and that the abuse never could have happened. However, the volunteer was alone in the vehicle with the boys, and there was no one who would be able to provide a supporting witness to the volunteer. The case went before the court. The judge found the victims to be telling the truth and sentenced the volunteer to time in jail. Over the course of many years, there are still people within the church that stand by the volunteer, and there are other people within the church that stand with the boys. It's such a sensitive topic because there are two different factions. So today we're going to talk about faith-based organizations. In other weeks, we're going to be talking about schools, why schools are vulnerable to abuse, why sporting leagues and organizations are vulnerable to abuse. Week number 4, we're going to talk about nursing homes, senior centers, why they are vulnerable to abuse. And we're going to end the month of March with looking at camps. As we hear about fallen leaders within the faith sector, and we hear about another leader that has failed, that has been identified as a sexual predator, our hearts can be broken. Because I'm a person of faith, I find it very difficult and heartbreaking to read of another faith leader. We should be better than this. We should do better. We must do better. Now, some people say it's because of the stresses of leadership. Sometimes people say that they fall prey to people that are trying to destroy their reputation and the work that they do. Other people say that there's abuse within the faith sector because priests can't marry. You've probably also heard me say that a child that is abused outside of the church questions the very existence of God. But for a child that is abused within the church, this then becomes their view of God. We hear predators say, well, we can thank God that God has given us this opportunity to do this. Or God has told me this is my reward for obedience. Faith-based organizations can be very vulnerable to abuse. So I have identified a few key reasons why faith-based organizations are vulnerable to abuse. And we can see some of this come out in our case study. The first reason I believe that faith-based organizations are very vulnerable to this is because of ignorance, denial, and fear. Too many times people have said to me, you know what, if we have policies, we're going to scare volunteers off. Other times I can remember hearing people say to me, it never even dawned on me that there could be abuse within the church. And even from some of these most recent stories that we're hearing about and reading about in the media, tell us that when there has been an allegation or a disclosure of abuse, we absolutely deny that it could have happened. Just like with the case study that I shared initially, there is a good segment of the church that is completely denying and saying there is no way this could happen. I have learned over the years from hearing way too many case studies that I can never emphatically say, yes, this did happen, or no, this did not happen. But I do think that within the church, we are ignorant to the prevalence of abuse and have been for many years. I think we're doing so much better than we did before. I can remember sitting across the table from a key leader in Canada who advocates for child safety. She had left the church many, many years before. And she said, Melodie, I work with every segment of our society. I work with every type of organization, but I don't work with the church because the church has their head in the sand on this issue of abuse. And they deny that it can actually ever happen to them, believing that God is going to protect them. So I just want to encourage you, and I have a tip when it comes to fear, denial, and ignorance. I think what we need is character, conviction, and courage. Up to 25% of the people within our pews are victim survivors of some form of abuse. Statistics tell us that is the stats for the number of people within your pews that are victim survivors of some form of abuse. If it is true that 1 out of every 3 women were sexually abused before they were 16 years of age, and 1 out of every 6 males were sexually abused before they were 16 years of age, our pews are filled with victim survivors of abuse. So I encourage you, courage when it comes to speaking on their behalf or speaking on your own behalf. It also takes a conviction that we will care for the oppressed. We will care for those that are in need. It takes a person of character to stand up against the pressures and say, yes, I will stand in the gap for those that do not have a voice. So I encourage you, when it comes to ignorance, fear, and denial, pray for wisdom. Be on the alert. Care for those within your community, because there are individuals within your community, both within the church and within your community, that needs someone to care for the spiritual healing of victim survivors. The second reason I think that churches are very vulnerable to abuse is because we have a real focus on restoration and transformation. There's an organization that many of us have heard about, Prison Fellowship. Prison Fellowship is committed to restorative justice and offender transformation. They are in the prisons. They are working in 110 countries. According to their website, 70% of released prisoners will commit another offense. But for those that they work closely with, one of the things that they encourage them to do is, once they're released from prison, is to find a faith community that will care for them. So yes, we do have a focus on restoration, forgiveness, transformation. We do truly want to believe that someone will not reoffend, but I really encourage faith-based organizations to have an offender covenant in place, because there are people within our pews that are offenders. It doesn't mean they will always reoffend, but there are long-term consequences. Yes, they may have served their time on behalf of society, but the sentence for child sexual abuse or child abuse can range from just home arrest to 18 months, 3 years, to 35 years, to lifetime imprisonment. Because the sentences vary so greatly, I think it's incumbent on our neighborhoods and our communities to take precautions. One of the ones that we recommend is having an offenders covenant, that if you know that there's an offender that's attending your church or your faith-based organization, that you should sit down and put a covenant agreement in place with them, setting parameters for their involvement, their interaction, their participation, and where in the building that they can be and who will accompany them when they are in the building. Another reason I believe that churches and faith-based organizations are vulnerable to abuse is because so many individuals lead double lives. They come into the church on a Sunday or on Sabbath. They're involved in leadership. They may be a deacon, a Sunday school teacher. They're teaching the statement of beliefs within your organization. You see them worshiping. You see them using holy language and praying. But behind closed doors, they live a completely double life. Again, as we read through investigative reports of sexual offenders, we find that they have 2 or 3 phones. They have hard drives filled with pornography. They travel to countries where they would have easy access to victims. They're leading double lives. We must hold leaders and individuals accountable. We must have a new form of discipleship where we are transparent, where we ask hard questions, where we have people that hold us accountable. If you question someone because of their actions or their deeds and they protest too much, that is an indicator that there is something that is wrong. We should be willing to be exposed to the truth. We must watch for warning signs. Another reason I think faith-based organizations are very vulnerable to abuse is because we do tend to have hero mentality. There are leaders within the faith-based community that we look up to and we admire, we aspire to. They write books, they speak, they have a following. We think that they are like that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even though I hear about abuse all the time, when I hear of another leader that has fallen, I am surprised. I'm heartbroken. I would have said that's the last person I would have imagined would have fallen and become a sexual predator. Another reason is I believe we're so trusting. We want to believe the very best in people. I actually remember hearing about a deacon that held the door open on a Sunday while someone was carrying computers and televisions out of the church. He held the door open and then he helped the man put the televisions and the computers into the car, only to find out that this was someone who was stealing equipment from the church. But the deacon was so trusting, he never questioned why someone, a stranger, was taking equipment out of the church. However, when someone does disclose abuse, we think that they may have wrong motives, that they're trying to destroy the church, trying to destroy our synagogues. We need whistleblower policies in place. We need a safe location for people to be able to call and raise a concern, disclose abuse, and that person is committed to believing the report. Finally, one of the reasons I think we're so vulnerable to abuse is because we need volunteers. I have never attended a church that didn't need more people to serve in the nursery or Sunday school or catechism. We're always looking for volunteers. Sometimes we just want anybody to come and sit with the children. I've even heard people say, will you be willing to attend and participate once every 6 weeks? Once a month, you just need to be in the classroom. I tell the story about my daughter who went to a church one of the very first Sundays that she had moved into a town to attend university. She was going to study education. And on the first Sunday of going into the church, the greeter at the door said, "Oh, you're new here. We've never seen you before." And she said, "Yes, I just moved into town. I'm going to university." And the greeter said, "Oh, what are you studying?" And she said, "Education." His eyes lit up and he said, "Wonderful. Would you like to teach Sunday school? I was told to recruit some Sunday school teachers today." He was going to take someone he didn't know at all and recruit them to be a Sunday school teacher that day. We're so trusting, and we are in need of volunteers. So I just really want to encourage you to make sure that you adhere to your screening process. Have people wait 6 months before you place them in a position of trust. Have them fill out an application, do interviews, check their references, do a criminal background check. Have them go through your initial orientation training. Once you've secured approval from leadership, then the person can begin to serve and be shadowed by an experienced leader. Let's raise the bar on safety within our faith-based organizations. I want to finish off with just the thought that often abuse is not part of our vocabulary. We don't talk about it. I've been attending church for most of my life, and I can count on one hand the number of sermons I have ever heard on the topic of abuse. Probably wouldn't even fill up one hand. And unfortunately, even though I've heard countless applications to sermons, I've seldom heard an application that relates to abuse. One of my family members was sexually abused when she was a child. She now is in her 80s, and she cheers me on when she talks to me about the work that I do. But what she said to me is, Melodie, no one would believe me. I didn't know what to call it. And anytime I began to talk about it, I would be shushed and said, don't talk about it. No one wants to hear about that. Abuse is not in our vocabulary. It's not in the vocabulary of our children. It's not in the vocabulary of our youth. It's not something we talk about. So I think it's so important that we raise awareness of abuse. Open up your training sessions to anyone within the congregation or community. Include a whole awareness section within your training. Awareness of the prevalence of abuse, awareness of definitions of abuse, how to recognize abuse, indicators of abuse, and why we are called to having a community of faith, of safety. One of my favorite verses is in Matthew 18, when Jesus called over a little child to stand among them. And he said, don't cause this little one to lose their faith. He also said, their angels have the eye of the Father. The Father's eyes are on those that are the weakest and most vulnerable within our community. Churches, faith-based organizations, mosques, synagogues, temples, we can do better. We must do better. We must be aware of our vulnerability. We must be aware of our weakness. We must not let that dear volunteer drive alone to pick up 2 children. We must hold our volunteers accountable. We must provide a witness that if there is ever an allegation of abuse, there is someone that can testify on their behalf. As disclosures and allegations come forward, we must take them seriously, and we must make safeguarding a priority. We can do better. We must do better. Next week, we're going to talk about why schools are vulnerable to abuse. See you next week. Bye.